Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Destroyer, titled Poison Season. But first, let's talk a little bit about lyrics. I've often been told that in comparison with most music critics, I pay way more attention to the writing than the sound of the album itself. And in a couple conversations with other critics, I've come to realize that I might be the exception rather than the rule in that approach. Where the conversation gets interesting is when it comes down to the mainstream public, because where I'm fairly certain I care more about the writing than some critics, I know for certain I care more than most audiences. And even then, it breaks down by genre how much one would really care. I mean, lyrics matter more in folk and country, and arguably more in hip-hop than they do in, say, electronica or symphonic metal. Now, I could argue I care more about the lyrics because I'm a writer myself and I love to decode poetry, good and bad, but I reckon even in the cases where they're easy to ignore, good writing can play a purpose. It's the primary method for the songwriter to convey their art story or meaning to the audience, with the sonic palette around them being what sets the mood and the atmosphere. For me, writing and instrumentation need to have a certain amount of balance when I consider an entire piece, with strengths and weaknesses in both being enough to save or sink an album. That's why, believe it or not, when I hear about records that are highly touted for their lyrics above all else and aren't hip-hop albums, I'm intrigued but a little bit cautious. I mean, sure, I'm predicated to like this sort of thing more, but that means as a critic, I have to make sure I'm not giving it undue praise when it's not earned. Thankfully, today we're talking about Destroyer, the project of Canadian singer-songwriter Dan Behar and an artist whose lyrical eccentricities are often matched by his eclectic and interesting instrumentation that at its worst can feel kinda sloppy or indulgent, but at its best can be genuinely breathtaking in its beauty and melodic composition. Affiliated with critically acclaimed indie rock group The New Pornographers, who really do have a disturbingly high record at producing great side projects from their members, the most striking thing about Destroyer is the choice to switch up musical sounds with nearly every single album. From that tight cohesion that defined the excellent Street Hawk and Thief, to the meandering yet kind of compelling mess of This Night, to the synth touch and goddamn spectacular Your Blues, to the drunken cacophony of Trouble and Dreams. Now, since his 2011 album Kaput, which I thought had some great writing and some gorgeous melodies, but could meander a little in the late 80s easy listening territory, Dan Behar's been taking longer and longer between releases. And now he's finally got a new album, Poison Season. And with it came the typical explosion of critical acclaim. So, was the album actually worthy of all of it? Well, honestly, I wasn't sure. I had to be straight with all you guys. This review has been a couple weeks in the making beyond just my usual examination of the full discography. Well, it's because Destroyer are a tricky band to untangle, and Poison Season is more than most. It's definitely an album that will demand a half dozen listens before one really gets it, and for me it was probably double that. And yet, even after that, this album's mood is very peculiar, an oddly wistful melancholia that seems at first to awkwardly clash with the instrumentation, but still is a way of drawing you in. And yet, the deeper I dove into untangling the reference-filled yet poetically stark record, I think we got one of the best goddamn albums of the year, period. And let me stress, I only really fell for this album when I decoded the lyrics in their entirety and mostly understood the themes. I think there will be a lot of people put off by this album because they don't understand it, they don't get it. I'm gonna try to alleviate some of that, so strap in. This review is probably gonna go long and get kinda crazy, just warning you. So let's start with the easiest part. Dan Behar's voice. Have to be honest, there have been points in the past where his half-murmured, half-whispered croon doesn't always connect with me, but it's got the odd quality being very emotive and expressive in a quiet, subtle way that can almost display more magnetism. I can't imagine anybody but Dan Behar singing this album because even despite the glitz and occasionally ruckus instrumentation, he's still precisely positioned in the mix to sound clear and remain one of the main primary focal points. It could have been sold more broadly, but I'm thrilled that that never really happens. That quiet simplicity works for him. Part of that, of course, is because the production is goddamn fantastic, giving the instrumentation a ton of glossy swell that never feels inorganic or forced. It's cinematic in capturing the mood of old Hollywood films without ever feeling like a throwback or faking lo-fi. Baroque without putting on airs or being pretentious, calling back to the smooth jazz of classical musicals while blending in elements of Latin music and funk and some faded reverb-touched guitars straight out of modern indie rock. And it never feels smooth or slick or anything close to cool. That's because it's got the world-weary maturity to never really care about that veneer. It's naturally reminiscent of 50s Sinatra, tempered with the raw honesty of the best 70s songwriters. Subversive at points, but still with an earnest power that's impossible to fake and puts the listener at a bit of an awkward place intentionally. Now, part of this is I don't really love the opening two songs. I didn't quite like the keyboard tone of the opener, felt a little bit too muted to me, and Dream Lover can sometimes feel a little bit too frenetic for its own good with the Springsteen-esque interweaving horns and the heavier drums as the bass struggles to maintain an underlying melody and a more potent groove. But moving beyond that, this album album is both strikingly varied and stunningly melodic. Perhaps the least obvious and yet most quintessential element to why so many of the songs just work for me is that bass groove, many of which often carry their own counterpoint melody to the rest of the song. The subtle foundation carrying forces from above even as the strings and horns wail against minuscule guitar flutters, the thick bass lick on Archer on the Beach that without that horn flourish would remind me of a Push the Sky Away era Nick Cave track, and that's a high compliment indeed, especially with the guitars just smoldering on the outro. The Latin funk vibe of Midnight Meets the Rain, although that bass would be easy to overlook when the guitars and the horns just seethe against that phenomenal piano line, the skittering percussion, or the more cinematic vibe of Bangkok, although the bass only really gets infectious on the back half of that song, even though the horns are goddamn beautiful all the way through it. And that's a running theme. The interweaving melodic arrangements of the horns and the strings are really impressive across the board, mostly because Behar knows how to play for the moments of jazz dissonance to shift the mood, like the increasingly explosive crescendo on Hell, or the roaring cacophony on The River. And then you have moments where the melody lines are so potent that even when stripped back, they can deliver some incredibly gorgeous emotional moments, like the distant pianos and that strings outro on Girl in a Sling gets me every time. Or the more upbeat Times Square that reminds me starkly of scenes from An Italian Restaurant by Billy Joel, one of my favorite songs. Or especially the film score swell of Bangkok with the flutes midway through the bridge of that gorgeous strings arrangement. The only real criticism I can make of many of these songs and the instrumentation is that it can feel a tad overlong in some of the outros at points, but really, when it sounds this potent and gorgeously melodic, that's hardly a complaint. I love a lot of the instrumentation here. But now, we need to get into the meat of this, the heart of why so many music critics like myself love to talk about Destroyer: lyrics and themes. Two things to keep in mind before we start this, because it's going to go deep. Number one, Destroyer frequently draws back to iconography throughout Dan Behar's entire career, hence the reason why I revisited that entire discography. And this album in particular should be read as an album statement. That's number two, because while songs do work on their own, the album informs much larger context, to say nothing of the underlying metaphors across multiple songs that have their own callbacks. There are those lyrical callbacks that draw so much more power when you have that context. And it's one of the many reasons that this album seems like a step away from the mainstream breakout that was Kaput. Of course, the other reason is the mood. With the cleaner, more jazzy production, you might expect something a little bit more broad or theatrical, but Behar has gone on this record by saying this is a darker album than others in his catalog. And he's not kidding. From the opening song, he sets the stage with one of the most potent lyrics I've heard this year. The writing on the wall wasn't writing at all. The implication that whatever foresight might have come has proven entirely for naught. Pitchfork wasn't wrong when they said that Behar seemed to be second-guessing himself on this album, but it's not so much a characteristic and a negative of the writing as it is the thematic through line of the entire album. This is where it should be noted that Behar often includes references to muses, and by that I mean the female personification of music, art, and inspiration throughout his entire discography, and it's no exception here, except many of the muses on this album are on their deathbeds or carrying slings with the light fading in and out of their eyes, or surrounded by all sides by cloying crowds which they just need to escape and get out of there. And it's not hard to see so many of these songs touching on the unexpected success of Kaput and how readily unprepared Behar was prepared to explore what might come next with that larger fan base. Mostly because he himself has grown older and he admits he's not as fun as he used to be. And with the sun rising, it'll be clear to everyone sooner rather than later. This is where we encounter the second major piece of iconography throughout this album. That night, the vast, open, dark sky, the void of infinite possibilities where stars are born and they die as well. And so much of this album features Behar staring into that void, searching for love or God or his muse or a combination of all three and finding no expected answer. The writing on the wall wasn't writing at all. And so there is the desire to retreat inwards, retract into the anonymity of the city that recalls more than anything Steven Wilson's Hand Cannot Erase Him earlier this year. And yet there are more moments of humanizing empathy on Girl in a Sling, where they can just stare out at the empty wealth of said cities and battle with that lack of answers, that lack of fulfillment. And yet even that can turn a little bit frosty in one of the most poetic tracks on this album, Archer on the Beach, featuring the titular character shooting for love and never really hitting, the mutation of the Ash King's depression and the frostiness of the Ice Queen into a recognition of the lonely depression that underscores them both in just different ways, and that storm brewing all the closer. And this really is a lonely record. Putting aside the directionless couple of Jody and Jack on Times Square, easy stand-ins for the every man and every woman obviously, Dan Behar's frustration curdles to target nearly everyone, even as it really is just just self-flagellation. The key word across this album is scum, and Behar makes it very clear he's talking about himself whenever he uses that word, which adds a whole nother layer to drama to the argument of Midnight Meet the Rain, as he faces the girl standing on deep water, which is a biblical reference as said defiant lover or muse being held aloft by her own faith. And yet even that is undercut and second-guessed on Solace's Bride, where the second-guessing becomes all the more clear and heartbreaking as the muse herself makes that second-guessing a moment. But the album really begins to snap into focus on Bangkok, as Behar focuses on Sunny, a character he wrote for a theme from children's literature, and yet Behar describes him as a depraved character, finally trying to display a moment to show it all, to reveal himself, and yet the masses, they're baffled by it. This is because, like so much of the best music written about the creative process, Dan Behar doesn't exclude the audience from that story. And to his credit, he frames them as just as lost and confused and lacking direction as he is. And it looks as though that he might have the answers, the audience, they throng around him to the point where it becomes kind of cloying and impossible for him to focus. And yet when faced with the real truth about him, he's showing who he really is, they can't recognize it. So okay, you follow that? Good, because now in the second to last song, Sun in the Sky, Dan Behar brings together one of the most stunningly powerful and layered thesis statements I've ever heard on an album, period. A song loaded with callbacks to other metaphors throughout this record that reasserts the uncertainty that comes with creativity. You don't start the fire, you just turn it on. The second verse shows him trying to push his night drama into music, and yet he left his keys on the kite. A kite, if you go back earlier into the record to Hell, that was a kite that washed up on the shoreline, never really taking off into that night and the flight of infinite possibilities and inspiration. The third verse sees him thinking of family or love for inspiration, and yet he floats down the River Rhine clutching a plastic bag, all the more hollow by it. Whenever he tries to wring inspiration from his life and that drama, it feels so hollow and placed in the real light of day, that revelatory moment. And that's when we get to the penultimate line on this album. I'm so much deeper than my drama. And when you pair it with the final song and its final lines, it rings as a statement that shows Behar embracing his own creative impulses wherever they might be, rejecting a world that would run to him for insight based on musings of his direction, which even he can't even hope to truly know on his own. But the repeated line that ends out the album, the returning reference to Jack and Judy, that directionless couple, the world looking for that direction wherever it might come, gives a glimmer of hope even if it doesn't give that direction. You can fall in love. Of course, the great irony of Poison Season by Destroyer is that for so much second guessing and confusion about that creative process, Destroyer did manage to make a goddamn excellent album on the way. And if you can't tell by now, I absolutely adore this record. Hands down, one of the best of the year that proves that Dan Behar remains a titan among singer-songwriters, though he'd never assume that title. This gets a light 9 out of 10 from me and the highest of my recommendations. Folks, I can't promise Poison Season is an easy listen. It's not. And I'm still not quite sure if it rises to the incredible heights he reached with his early 2000s work. I still think Your Blues might be the best thing he's ever done, and that's saying something. But if you're looking for a challenging, intellectually and emotionally fulfilling listen, Destroyer delivers. Oh dear God, they deliver. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. This review got a little bit heavy, but please, I know a lot of this is real poetry. I'm curious on your interpretations of the lyrics, because this is one of those albums that really could go in so many different ways. But outside of that, is there anything else you might want me to cover coming up the next couple of weeks, or anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation? I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.